All right, now I'd like to welcome Dr. Melissa Cortez to our virtual stage. She is the Assistant Professor of Biological Sciences at Bethel University. Dr. Cortez, we're all excited to hear more about the science behind curiosity. I don't know anything about that, so I'm super pumped to hear your insights and to walk away knowing a little bit more about where my curiosity lives in this head of mine. So take it away.
Awesome. I am actually going to be sharing my screen, so give me just one moment to do that with you. All right. Can I get a thumbs up if you can see my screen? All right. Awesome. All right. So my name is Dr. Melissa Cortez, and I am a professor of biology and neuroscience at Bethel University in St. Paul, Minnesota. So that means that during the week, I teach classes about neuroscience and human physiology to college freshmen through seniors. The classes have lecture parts where they have to listen to me for a really long time. And then they have lab parts where the students get to do fun experiments. Just yesterday, my physiology students did EKGs all day, measuring their heart's electrical activity. So I also do neuroscience research with students on campus, and I'll talk just a little bit about that later. On the weekends, I enjoy being outside with my husband and 3 kids. They're 6.5, 3.5, and 1.5. Today, I'm going to talk to you about curiosity, what it is and why it is so rewarding. I'll also tell you about what I'm curious about and how curiosity determined what I did for a career. All right, so first we have to start by talking about what is curiosity. So very simply, it is the desire to learn something new. In children, they're drawn to things and experiences that are often bright, loud, colorful, or otherwise exciting. Here's my youngest painting pretty much anything she can find with bright colors. As we get older, this becomes an impulse towards more detailed scientific and philosophic understanding. Here are my older kids digging out carrots from the ground, asking why some are bigger than others, why some are strange shapes, and other questions about things they find. As we get older, we often aren't curious about quite as many things. The diversity of your curiosity may decrease as you age, meaning that you're no longer curious about every shiny object that crosses your path. But that doesn't mean your curiosity is less, it's just driven towards specific subjects. So curiosity can also mean doing work to find out new things, and it can challenge us a lot. So why would we continue to be curious? Well, I don't know how familiar you are with Curious George. As a mom with little kids, I'm quite familiar with him. And it turns out his theme song is actually pretty great. Get curious, and that's marvelous. And that's your reward. You'll never be bored. If you ask yourself, what is this? Like Curious George. When you look closely at the song, you'll notice that it actually suggests that curiosity is its own reward in adding interest and motivation to your life. So how could we determine if this song and the idea that curiosity is rewarding is actually true? Well, neuroscience, of course. The answer is always neuroscience. Your brain is made up of cells called neurons and glial cells. Neurons send the signals, which are electrical in nature, and glial cells support them. When a neuron is excited, it has a change in voltage, and that voltage passes down the neuron just like electricity down the wire. When it gets to the end of the neuron, which is on the right-hand side of your screen, it releases chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. These will bind to other neurons and pass the signal on further. It's like the most incredibly elaborate game of telephone you've ever seen. Neurons work together in certain parts of the brain to help us interpret and pass on signals about certain things. We have areas that help us interpret sounds over here, sights back here, tastes around in there, and smells way up behind your nose, as well as areas that help us understand and feel emotions. So when you do something that you enjoy, 2 areas in particular, the nucleus accumbens, shown here in pink, and the ventral tegmental area, the ventral tegmental area shown in blue, these 2 areas are really, really active when you do something you like. So the ventral tegmental area, once again in blue, that makes a chemical called dopamine. Now, dopamine you may have heard of before. This is a chemical that makes you excited to do things. It's also the chemical you pump out in response to caffeine, making you feel like you can perk up and get stuff done for the day. When you do something that you enjoy, neurons in the ventral tegmental area send electrical signals to the nucleus accumbens down their wires called axons. When they get to the nucleus accumbens, they release dopamine. It makes you feel rewarded. So the ventral tegmental area makes you want to do something or learn something, and the accumbens rewards you once you actually do it. This is true when you eat something you enjoy, when you do something you enjoy, and it's an important part of forming habits. These same areas of the brain can be hijacked and lead to addiction to things that are unhealthy. Fortunately, these areas can also encourage good things like curiosity. In fact, one study, they asked people trivia questions about anything from history to music to sports to animals, pretty much anything you could think of. If the people didn't know the answer, they were asked how curious were they to find out the answer. Then they were put in an fMRI machine. Some of you may have had an MRI at some point in response to an injury or in preparation for surgery. Unlike a typical MRI, an fMRI isn't a still picture. It measures activity in the brain in response to certain stimuli. So while in the fMRI machine, the participants were read the questions again. Then there was a delay before they would be told the answers. Their brain activity was stronger, there was more electricity, the more curious they had said they were about each question. So here on the right, where the curiosity rating was the highest at a 6, those represent the questions that they were most curious to learn the answers about. They correlate with the highest activity seen on the fMRI, both in the nucleus accumbens and in the ventral tegmental area. Activity here is measured by how much oxygen that part of the brain is using. Oxygen is necessary to make energy to send the signals. Here we see high activity in the accumbens and the ventral tegmental area. Here it happens to be paired with another area called substantia nigra. These are the same areas we saw involved in reward to things you do or to things you eat that you enjoy. Additionally, while the participants were waiting to find out the answers that they really wanted to know, they were also given information that they didn't care about. In this case, it was faces of people they didn't know. After a brief flashing of the face, the answer to the question was given to them. After the fMRI, and again, a day or so later, the participants were asked to identify the faces they saw in the fMRI machine. It turned out that the faces they saw while they were the most curious were able to be remembered better. What this means is once your curiosity is piqued, anything you learn during that time will be remembered better, even if you don't care about the thing you learned about while you were curious. This is because the ventral tegmental area, while it's sending dopamine to accumbens to reward you, it also sends dopamine to your hippocampus, shown here, which is the part of your brain that makes memories. So curiosity doesn't just lead to a feeling of reward, it also makes the information you learn while curious more memorable. Another study that used fMRI to look at curiosity found that people were the most curious about questions that they thought they might know the answer to, more so than questions they definitely didn't know the answers to. They also had higher activity in areas of reward, like putamen, which is shown here. Putamen is connected to the ventral tegmental area, so these are all going together. So it is connected to putamen, and they found that when they found the answer that they might know was not correct, they were actually more rewarded by correcting that false information. This implies that we're even more motivated and rewarded when we're able to fill in gaps in our understanding. So they were most curious about questions where they thought they probably knew the answer, but they were most rewarded when they were able to correct wrong information that they thought they knew. So I know I've always found joy in filling in missing pieces of my knowledge. I've always been curious about animals, and when I was younger, I wanted to be a vet. I worked at a vet clinic in high school and majored in biology in college. While in college, I got a job as a zookeeper and got to take care of all sorts of animals. cows, snakes, bats, turtles, eagles, possums, more. Some of my favorites were the groundhog, shown here on the left. Her name was Walnut. And the porcupine, shown in 2 pictures here because he was extra special. His name was Pokey. And I loved working with these animals. I would share my peanut butter and banana sandwiches with the woodchuck. I trained her to come out on Groundhog Day. Woodchuck, groundhog, same thing. I realized I used both words, but it's the same animal. I learned to pick up the porcupine. They actually don't have quills on their belly. And so if they're willing, you should not try this, but if they're willing, you can actually pick them up. I'd carry him around and he'd actually sing for me. They were so much fun to watch and they did such silly things. I absolutely loved learning about them and working with them. I was so curious about why they did the things they did that I realized I didn't want to be a veterinarian. I really just wanted to learn about why animals behave the way they do. After college, I taught high school biology. I ran a kids camp. I worked at a Humane Society. I worked at a nature center. I worked at a coffee shop. But I still found myself having questions about why animals and people do the things they do. I ended up going on to get my PhD from the University of Wisconsin, studying how hormones act in the brain to make animals communicate the way they do. While at the University of Wisconsin, I found myself interested in so many things and curious about a really wide range of topics. My mentor, Dr. Lauren Reeders, would always bring me back to focus by asking, "But what's your question?" I would proceed to tell her something that I had super interesting, and she'd repeat, "But what's your question?" Curiosity can get you started, but the true test of curiosity is the formation of the question so that you can go and find answers. Now I study songbirds called starlings and how they change the way they sing depending on which other birds are around and whether they have a nest box or not. Sometimes I sit outside and watch the birds behave and make notes of who the dominant ones are and how often they sing. And other times I'm in the lab doing experiments on the brain tissue. I ask questions about what affects their behavior and which chemicals in the brain are interacting to reward them for singing in the right way. We hope that our research will affect the way we understand the way human brains reward communication in different social contexts. For example, individuals on the autism spectrum often do not find social communication rewarding. I ask questions about which hormones and chemicals the birds are using to reward their social communication, to therefore better understand how social communication in humans is affected. Every time I find an answer, it usually just leads to more questions. But work is always rewarding when you get to be curious every day. And that's your reward. You'll never be bored. I hope that today I've given you just enough info about a lot of different things so that you can be curious enough to fill in the gaps and remember the things you learn along the way. I am more than happy to answer questions in the Q&A, and I'll look those over really quickly and see if there's any that I can answer before my time is up. Thanks. I see a question that says, is there a way to artificially start curiosity? Well, in the lab, you could do it by artificially depolarizing. You could artificially depolarize the neurons, and you could actually start an action potential. However, inserting an electrode into the brain is not generally something that we would do to a living human being. But you could, in fact, in the lab, start an action potential in these areas, and you can increase the seeking behavior that animals will do. So if you take 2 mice, for example, and you look at how often they explore their environment, you could artificially increase the curiosity in certain areas, and that particular mouse would explore his area more. But that's not something we would do in humans. One of the things that I took away from these studies is just the fact that even if you're not particularly curious about the thing you're learning at the moment, if you're in a curious state, you're still more likely to remember the things that you learned during that time. It says, "Do old birds sing?" You know how old people have kind of bad vocal cords. Yes, so our birds have really, really interesting ways to sing. We have a larynx that is our voice box. Birds have what's called a syrinx, and it's actually 2 parts. So they can make two sounds simultaneously. So they can produce two sounds at the same time. These birds, starlings, are very, very common, and that's actually why we use them. There's about 2 billion in the United States, and they were brought here as an invasive species. They are incredibly gifted at changing their communication depending on their social circumstance as well as their hierarchy, their dominance hierarchy. And they are also one of the few birds that can add to their vocabulary through their life, and their songs get more and more and more complex the more they learn, just like humans. And so when it comes to finding a model for human communication and reward, starlings are actually a really, really great model system, and they're used all over the world for these purposes. Somebody asked if they mind if they contact me. They can certainly contact me either on LinkedIn or via Bethel.
Awesome. Well, let's give a huge thank you to Dr. Melissa. It sounds like we should all get a lot more curious as we're studying and trying to remember information. That was super helpful and a ton of insight that I'm walking away with.